Hello, humans. So, the philosopher Sam Harris and the Vox co founder Erza Klein recently had a clash on the topic of IQ and race. And this clash highlighted three things for me. Firstly, I noticed that the depth of public conversation around this topic is quite shallow, with the false nature and nurture dichotomy still lingering in some circles. Secondly, I also noticed there is a disinterest among these public intellectuals to actually understand some of the core concepts in genetics and then explain them to their audiences. And then finally, I feel that this disinterest confuses their audiences and forces them to throw strawman arguments at each other. Their fans end up wasting a lot of time arguing back and forth without actually addressing the core issue. So people are mostly left on their own and they try to follow the plot and understand the disagreement by listening or reading one commentary after another before finally getting overwhelmed by the whole thing. What is going on here? And the most unfortunate part for me is that what people get out of this whole intellectual journey, if they actually happen to venture into it fully, are tweets like these. The emotions floating around the controversy become the main topic, with focus on personalities of Harris and Klein instead of the original point of contention. Accusations such as gaslighting and PC policing, they get discussed most, and the conversation eventually becomes gossipy, lacking any interest in the core concepts of the topic itself. Now, I know that it's not the job of these two to teach biology, but then when they're willing to actually debate and explore these topics, I do feel that some responsibility falls on their shoulders to invite experts in the field from both sides who can explain the basics instead of just throwing phrases like studies have shown or majority of academics agree. But I get it, there's not enough time to do all the things correctly, especially when a large proportion of your audience is just waiting to get outraged on social media. So I thought I'll try to share a few concepts on how genes and environments interact together. I hope this will help you in shaping your thinking while discussing not just the topic of race and IQ, but all kinds of complex behaviors like depression and happiness. Before I get started though, let me put a few of my personal opinions on the table. And these are mostly biases. I don't think they're biases, but if there are, I just want to put them on the table right now. I don't believe Sam Harris is racially motivated, and I'm pretty ambiguous about Charles Murray. I have many more reasons to believe that Harris's intention in exploring these topics is healthy, and I assume both of them are simply curious about controversial topics and equally despise the PC culture. I also believe that the mistreatment of Charles Murray on university campuses is not right. No matter what his real intentions are, he should be welcomed at universities to speak and debate with people who disagree with him. And that's the only way to find out whether he's actually intellectually honest or whether he's racially motivated or not. These are some of the pictures that I captured online, and they show how he has been stopped from speaking multiple universities. And Erza Klein, who wrote an article recently which was largely critical of Sam Harris and Charles Murray, agrees on this point. He writes, and I quote, "There is a lesson in here for college protesters. When protests turn violent, when invited speakers are publicly denied the chance to make their arguments, they become martyrs for free speech. And the resulting reaction both makes their ideas seem sexier and gives them the allies they wouldn't otherwise have had." And I agree with that. And finally, I would also like to mention that I don't enjoy and I don't think that Harris's singular focus on PC culture when it comes to a controversial topic like race and IQ is healthy. There's of course nothing wrong in talking about it. But if you're willing to defend free speech on this topic, you should be prepared to talk about the details of the issue with experts on both sides. You have a large following, and this expectations comes with that. Otherwise, your fans are naturally going to be pissed, as they will observe on social media that you're becoming a hero for the alt-right. Now, since this video discusses complex relationships between gene and environment, I also want to get two basic concepts out of the way. Most of you would know that the phenotype is simply an observable trait or behavior that results from a combination of genes and environments. Eye color is a phenotype. Height is a phenotype. A dog licking its balls is a phenotype. And human behaviors like crying and laughter, they also happen to be phenotypes. And of course, this is in contrast with genotype, which focuses on the nucleotides in your genome, A, B, A, G, C, T. Secondly, and this is the more complex one, the concept of heritability. And you will see this term thrown around a lot in this whole debate around IQ and race. Now, heritability refers to the amount of variation among people on a phenotype that can be attributed to genetic variations. The emphasis here is on variation among people. There is no concept of heritability when it comes to individuals. It is strictly applicable to populations. It's a very important point. Hopefully, this will become clear with a couple of examples. Let's say you have a population where everyone happens to have brown eyes. No variation whatsoever on the eye color phenotype that can be attributed to genes present in the population. Again, no variation. In this case, we would say that heritability of eye color is 0. So even if eye color is completely caused by genes and not the environment, the fact that there is no variation in the population makes the heritability 0. Now let's say that we have a group of plants of the same species. They are getting exact same environment for nutrition. They're getting the exact same nature of soil, the lighting, everything is identical. But then we see a lot of difference in their growth. Some are big, some are small. All of this difference would be therefore attributed to variation in genes in that group. So in this case, the heritability would be 100% or 1. Again, keep in mind that we can say nothing about how much percentage of a single plant's growth had to do with genetic factors. All we can say is how much variation can be attributed to genetic factors. So the next time you do well on an IQ test and then someone tells you that IQ is heritable, don't just go running around the town and shouting that you have great IQ genes. That's just wrong. So the main lesson in this video is on the topic of gene-environment covariance or gene-environment correlation. It is by no means controversial to say that genes and environments act together in shaping a phenotype. Actually, in the field of epigenetics has poked a big hole in the philosophy of genetic determinism by showing how genes are turned on or off based on specific environments. Simply having a set of genes is not that important in a lot of cases, especially in complex behaviors. You do need an accompanying environment for the effect to show up. And the genes and the environment interact with each other in very complex ways, as you will see in future slides. And this effect of genes on environment and the effect of environment on genes is what gene-environment correlation is all about. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's not the genes that are heritable. Genes are modifying our behaviors, which in turn modify our environments we find ourselves in. So not only the genes are getting passed on, but the environments too. And this concept was brilliantly articulated by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Extended Phenotype. If you haven't checked out that book, I highly recommend it. The main thesis of the book is that genes are not just affecting the animals that they're part of. They're affecting the other animals surrounding that animal who has the genes. It's a very interesting book. It's a bit philosophical, but I think if you've read anything by Richard Dawkins, it's, you know that his writing is just brilliant. So this is one of my favorite books overall. So I totally recommend it. So the GE covariance comes in three flavors. The passive GE covariance is an interesting one. It occurs when the biological parents raising their kids not only provide their genes, but they also provide the developmental environment in which their kids grow. So, for example, intelligent parents are transferring their genes for higher IQ. But not only that, they're also creating an environment that complements those genes. It's important to keep in mind here that the child's environment has no direct correlation with his or her genotype. It's only the environment. And the environment is like a bonus that comes along with the good genes. Of course, all of this changes if the intelligent parents happen to have a terrible marriage, let's say. The marriage issues lead to drinking or drug problems in parents, which then leads to child neglect. And it's also true for parents with genetic predisposition for depression, because those parents are not going to be able to create a healthy environment, and that again can possibly lead to child neglect. This diagram explains the exact same thing, that the parent is not only giving their genotype, but they're also giving the environment that the child grows up in, and both of them then affect the actual phenotype of the child. The next one is the reactive GE covariance. Now, I personally find this most fascinating, and I think it's very relevant to the conversation around race and IQ. Now, let's say you have a population in which there are these green circles and red circles. The red circle happens to be a mutation, and there is a small population which happens to be red in color. So the red color phenotype P1 in this case is due to the genes and the mutation in those genes. Now what happens is that due to that red color, that subpopulation of red humans gets discriminated, and the green ones form a cluster, and the red ones form a cluster separately. And over like generations, this discrimination keeps happening, and due to that, there is a unique environment that those red circles are now living in. And that unique environment then ends up changing another feature, another phenotype, and you'll notice that those circles have sort of become elliptical. And this is why this is fascinating, right? You have two different races, black and white, in America, and there is just so much history in terms of slavery and racism. So it's not just the genes that affected the color of the skin, but then due to that, there was a unique environment, and addition of both of them possibly ended up creating another phenotype P2, which was the result in IQ tests. Again, there is no guarantee that this actually happened, but this is a possibility, right? This diagram again shows the same thing, that you have a genotype which leads to a phenotype P1 in the child, and that phenotype itself then creates a unique environment for that child, and that unique environment then ends up creating another change in the phenotype P2. So I think Sam Harris needs to pay attention to this one more in his arguments, or at least Charles Murray has to pay attention to this one more. The final GE covariance is the active GE covariance. This one happens when the environment is actively shaped by the behaviors or actions caused by a initial small difference in the genotype. So for instance, let's say there are two groups of kids, A and B, who happen to have a very small difference, genetic difference in terms of their intelligence. And this small difference then leads up to differences in, let's say, study habits, which would be a phenotypic difference. And this phenotypic difference then essentially changes the environment in which these kids develop, right? And over time, this accumulation of environmental difference leads to a measurable IQ difference. This is another possibility here, that the child itself is changing the environment due to that small genetic difference, and that change in environment in which the child is growing, which is not coming from parents in this case, coming from the child himself or herself, ends up creating measurable IQ difference. So even though they started with a small difference, the difference kept expanding due to the environment created by child himself. So two groups of children, they have two different kinds of phenotype, but at this point the difference is not that much. This difference in phenotypes then create a difference in the environment that those childs are brought up in, and then the difference in phenotypes are expanded a lot more. In this case, P2 is basically the IQ test. And it's important to understand that it's very hard to know what the effect of P child 1 and P child 2 is in this diagram. All we see in the end is from the first G child 1, G child 2 to P2 child 1 and P2 child 2. So it's very hard to measure what's happening in the middle. Now, it is obvious, but it is important to state that intelligence is a complex phenotype. Much more complex than a phenotype like height. With height, we can see the direct heritability via genes. What I mean by that is that the external environment outside of an individual's body tends to play a very little role, if any. But same cannot be said, at least at this point, for a fluid concept like intelligence or even depression. A complex interplay of gene and environment could be playing a huge role here. And there could be multiple GE covariances that are acting together. The passive and the reactive could both act together. Simplifying a behavior with concepts like nature and nurture can be useful occasionally, but for controversial conversations like IQ and race, or even causes of depression, we need to do a better job to educate people on the complex causal mechanisms involved in human behavior. And as I said, that it's insanely hard, impossible even, to find out the measurable effects of long-term abusive environments like slavery or segregation. How do we even go about measuring that? But there is a larger lesson here on dangers of shallow conversations. You see, if people are actually curious about the world, they cannot avoid learning some of the details of how things work. But details are boring. Even if our public intellectuals are interested in them, the details won't stand out in their commentary. Witty one-liners or slides are more sexy and are more reproducible. And due to this, their audiences are more vulnerable to the lure of gossip and strawman arguments, which are only designed to defeat the opposing tribe. This phenomenon not only doesn't educate us in any interesting way, it further ignites us. It further ignites the division between people who already disagree with each other. And in the end, our social media memes designed by cultural evolution end up using us day in and day out for the purpose of spreading them. So I have a suggestion for you. Next time you are tempted to pay attention to gossip or drama involving public intellectuals, just stop and observe the beautiful power of memes. Notice how our meme lords are luring us to comment in our minds or even online on things that have nothing to do with the academic details of the topic itself. They want to steer us towards creating an entertaining story out of this, with a hero and a villain. And this temptation is unfortunately one of our oldest weaknesses, rooted in natural selection. And they know it.